In the scorching heat of a Nevada afternoon, dust clouds swirled behind the weathered wheels of Jake Morrison's motorcycle as he approached what appeared to be nothing more than another forgotten relic of the American West. The town of Silverton had been marked on his grandfather's old map, but according to every modern GPS system, this place had been officially abandoned since 1962. Yet here he was, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain, riding toward a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to shimmer like a mirage against the desert landscape. The first thing that struck Jake as wrong was the smoke. Thin wisps of white smoke curled up from 3 different chimneys, impossibly delicate against the harsh blue sky. Ghost towns didn't have smoke. Ghost towns didn't have laundry hanging on lines between buildings, fluttering in the desert wind like pale flags of surrender. And ghost towns certainly didn't have 4 women standing perfectly still on the main street, watching him approach with expressions that seemed carved from stone. Jake cut the engine of his Harley and felt the sudden silence press against his eardrums like a physical weight. The leather of his jacket creaked as he swung his leg over the bike, his boots hitting the packed earth with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in the open space. The women hadn't moved. They stood spaced apart along the dusty main street like sentinels, each one dressed in black clothing that belonged to another era entirely. The nearest woman appeared to be in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her cheekbones. Her dress reached nearly to her ankles, and her hands were folded precisely at her waist. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the distance between them, crisp and formal as if she were addressing a congregation rather than a lone traveler. "Mr. Morrison," she said, and Jake felt ice water flood his veins despite the desert heat. "We've been expecting you." How could she possibly know his name? Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the pepper spray clipped to his belt, but something in the woman's bearing made him hesitate. There was no menace in her posture, only a kind of weary resignation that seemed to settle over the entire scene like dust. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Jake managed, his voice sounding strange and thin in the vast open space. The woman's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it held no warmth. "I am Margaret Whitmore," she replied, stepping forward with measured precision. "This is Eleanor Crenshaw, Beatrice Fleming, and Virginia Ashford." She gestured to each woman in turn, and Jake noticed that they all shared the same peculiar stillness, as if they were actors who had forgotten they were supposed to move between their lines. Eleanor was perhaps the youngest of the 4, though Jake guessed she was still well into her 50s. Her dark hair showed streaks of premature gray, and her eyes held a haunted quality that made Jake want to look away. Beatrice appeared to be the eldest, her white hair gleaming like silver wire in the harsh sunlight, while Virginia stood slightly apart from the others, her pale blue eyes fixed on some point beyond Jake's shoulder as if she were seeing something he couldn't. "How did you know I was coming?" Jake asked, and immediately regretted the question when he saw the look that passed between the 4 women. It was quick, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of shared secrets and unspoken agreements. "The same way we know you're Henry Morrison's grandson," Margaret replied smoothly. "The same way we know you've been searching for answers about what happened to him in 1962. The same way we know you won't leave here until you find what you're looking for." The mention of his grandfather's name hit Jake like a physical blow. Henry Morrison had disappeared during a cross-country motorcycle trip 61 years ago, vanishing somewhere in the Nevada desert without a trace. The police had found his bike 20 miles south of here, but Henry himself had never been seen again. Jake had been obsessed with the mystery his entire life, following every lead, chasing every rumor, determined to solve the puzzle that had haunted his family for 3 generations. "What do you know about my grandfather?" Jake demanded, taking a step forward. The women didn't retreat, but something shifted in the air between them, a tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Everything," Eleanor said quietly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was softer than Margaret's, but it carried an undercurrent of something that might have been regret. "We know everything, Mr. Morrison, because we were here when it happened." Impossible. Jake did the math quickly in his head. Even if Eleanor had been a teenager in 1962, she would have to be well into her 70s now. None of these women looked older than their 60s, and Eleanor could have passed for 50 in the right light. Yet there was something about their eyes, something ancient and knowing that seemed to contradict their physical appearances. "That's not possible," Jake said. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt doubt creeping in around the edges. Nothing about this situation made sense. The town that shouldn't exist, the women who couldn't be who they claimed to be, the impossible knowledge of his name and his purpose. Yet here he stood, surrounded by evidence that the impossible was happening all around him. Many things that seem impossible become quite ordinary when you've lived in a place like Silverton long enough, Beatrice said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that spoke of advanced age despite her relatively youthful appearance. "Time moves differently here, Mr. Morrison. It has ever since the accident." "What accident?" Jake pressed, but Margaret raised one pale hand to silence him. "All in due time," she said with that same formal precision. "First, you must understand that your arrival here was not chance. You were drawn here just as your grandfather was drawn here, just as all the Morrison men have been drawn here for generations. There is something in your bloodline, something that calls to this place and its secrets." Jake wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, wanted to dismiss these women as delusional hermits who had been living in isolation too long. But deep in his chest, he felt a recognition that he couldn't explain, a sense that he had been moving toward this moment his entire life. Every decision that had led him here suddenly seemed inevitable, as if he had been following a script written long before his birth. "Your grandfather was 24 when he arrived here." Virginia spoke suddenly, her pale eyes finally focusing on Jake's face with startling intensity. "The same age you are now." He had the same questions, the same burning need to understand. "And like you, he thought he could simply take what he wanted and leave." "What happened to him?" Jake's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the strange acoustics of the abandoned town, it seemed to carry forever. The four women exchanged another look, and Jake sensed some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Margaret stepped forward until she was close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of age despite her relatively smooth skin. "Your grandfather discovered our secret, Mr. Morrison, just as you are about to discover it. But knowledge, once gained, cannot be ungained. And some truths exact a price that cannot be paid in ordinary currency." Before Jake could ask what she meant, Eleanor stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was surprisingly warm, but there was something else, something that sent electricity racing up his nerves and made his vision blur at the edges. Suddenly, Jake was no longer standing in the dusty street of an abandoned town. Instead, he found himself in the same location, but it was 61 years earlier. The buildings around him were painted and well-maintained, with glass in the windows and signs hanging over the doorways. The street bustled with activity as men in work clothes moved between the buildings, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. Silverton was a mining town. Eleanor's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing inside his skull rather than through his ears. Silver and copper, mostly, but there were rumors of other things buried deeper in the earth. Stranger things. Jake watched as miners emerged from a shaft that had been boarded up in his own time, their faces grim with exhaustion. But there was something else in their expressions, something that looked almost like fear. One man stumbled as he walked, and Jake noticed that his eyes had a peculiar milky quality, as if he were going blind. The deeper they dug, the more wrong things became. Beatrice's voice joined Eleanor's in the strange internal narration. Men would go down healthy and strong, but they would come back changed. Some went blind. Others began to age rapidly, gaining years in a matter of weeks. And some simply never came back at all. The scene shifted, and Jake found himself inside what looked like a mining office. Charts covered the walls, showing the layout of tunnels that extended deep into the earth below Silverton. But these weren't ordinary mining charts. The deeper levels were marked with symbols that Jake didn't recognize, strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when he tried to focus on them directly. The company tried to cover it up, of course. Margaret's voice added to the chorus. They told the families that the missing men had simply quit and moved on. They attributed the illnesses to ordinary mining hazards. But we knew better. We four were the wives of the men who went the deepest, who saw what was really down there in the dark. Jake saw them then, 61 years younger but unmistakably the same women. Margaret was a stunning brunette in her 30s, Eleanor a fierce redhead with fire in her eyes, Beatrice a elegant blonde with porcelain skin, and Virginia a dark-haired beauty with the same pale blue eyes that had looked right through him in the present. They stood together outside the mining office, their faces set with determination as they confronted a man in an expensive suit who was clearly trying to dismiss their concerns. "Our husbands went down into that mine and never came back," the younger Margaret was saying, her voice tight with controlled fury. "We want answers, Mr. Crawford. We want to know what's really down there." The man in the suit, Crawford, mopped his brow with a handkerchief despite the desert heat seeming less oppressive in this past version of Silverton. "Ladies, I understand your distress, but there are dangers in mining that sometimes claim good men. Your husbands knew the risks when they took the job. Don't lie to us," the younger Eleanor snapped, stepping forward with her hands clenched into fists. "We've seen the others who came back. We've seen what that place did to them. Tom Henderson aged 30 years in 3 weeks before he died. Carl Brennan went completely blind and started speaking in languages no one recognized. And Marcus Fleming." She looked toward Beatrice, whose face had gone pale. "Marcus came back, but it wasn't Marcus anymore. Something else was wearing his face." The scene wavered and shifted again, and Jake found himself in a different time entirely. The mining operation had been shut down, the equipment removed, but the 4 women remained. They were older now, perhaps in their 40s, and they moved with the purposeful determination of people who had found their calling. "After the company abandoned the town, we stayed," Virginia's voice explained as Jake watched the women boarding up windows and sealing doors with materials that looked far more substantial than ordinary lumber. Someone had to keep watch. Someone had to make sure that what was down there stayed down there. Jake saw them working together to create elaborate symbols on the boarded-up entrance to the mine, carving patterns into the wood with tools that seemed to gleam with their own inner light. The symbols were similar to the ones he had seen on the mining charts, but these were clearly designed for a different purpose entirely. "We learned things," Beatrice's voice continued. "Terrible, wonderful, impossible things. We learned that there are places in the earth where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. We learned that some kinds of knowledge can change you in ways that can never be undone. And we learned that someone has to stand guard, no matter the cost." The vision shifted once more, and Jake saw his grandfather's motorcycle pulling into town exactly as his own had done. Henry Morrison was young and confident, his leather jacket bearing patches from a dozen different motorcycle clubs, his face eager with the anticipation of adventure. Jake watched his grandfather park his bike in almost the exact same spot where Jake's Harley now sat, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert temperature. "Your grandfather was drawn here by the same force that brought you," Margaret's voice said as Jake watched Henry approach the 4 women, who looked exactly as they had appeared to Jake in the present day. "The Morrison bloodline carries something that resonates with the power buried beneath Silverton. Your ancestors were miners themselves generations ago, and some of them worked claims that went deeper than they should have." Jake watched his grandfather's conversation with the women, seeing his own confusion and skepticism mirrored in Henry's face. But there was something else there too, a recognition that Jake understood now because he felt it himself. Henry belonged here in a way that defied rational explanation, as if he had been searching for this place his entire life without knowing it. "He demanded to see the mine," Eleanor's voice narrated as Jake watched his grandfather's increasing agitation. "Just as you will demand to see it. The Morrison men are all the same in that regard. You cannot be told about mysteries. You must experience them for yourselves." The scene played out with terrible inevitability. Henry's initial skepticism gave way to fascination as the women showed him evidence of the mine's impossible properties. Documents that detailed the strange transformations that had befallen the miners. Photographs of men who had aged decades in a matter of days. And finally, reluctantly, they led him to the sealed entrance of the mine itself. "We tried to warn him." Beatrice's voice carried infinite sadness as Jake watched his grandfather examine the strange symbols carved into the barriers. "We explained that some knowledge comes with a price that cannot be paid in installments." But he was young and certain that he could handle whatever lay beneath. Jake watched in horror as his grandfather began to pry away the carefully constructed barriers, ignoring the women's increasingly desperate pleas for him to stop. The symbols seemed to pulse with a sickly light as Henry's crowbar broke through the wood, and Jake heard sounds emerging from the darkness beyond that made his skin crawl. The barriers were not just to keep things in, Virginia's voice explained as Henry stepped into the mine shaft with a flashlight in his hand. "They were also to keep people out. The mine calls to certain bloodlines, Mr. Morrison. It whispers promises of knowledge and power, and some men cannot resist that call no matter the cost." The vision followed Henry down into the depths of the mine, through passages that seemed to stretch far deeper than any natural cave system should have extended. The walls were lined with symbols similar to those Jake had seen earlier, but these were carved directly into the living rock and seemed to pulse with their own inner light. And the deeper Henry went, the more wrong everything became. The passages opened into vast chambers that could not possibly have existed beneath the small town of Silverton. Some were filled with a phosphorescent mist that moved with deliberate purpose, while others contained structures that hurt to look at directly, geometric impossibilities that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. And in the deepest chamber of all, Henry found something that made him drop his flashlight and scream. Jake couldn't see what his grandfather had discovered, but he felt its presence like a weight pressing against his consciousness. Something vast and ancient and utterly alien. Something that regarded human existence with the same casual indifference that humans might show toward insects. Henry tried to run, but the mine had already begun to change him, and Jake watched in horror as his grandfather's face began to shift and age with each step he took. "Time moves differently in the deep places," Margaret's voice explained as Jake watched his grandfather struggle through passages that seemed to stretch and contract like living tissue. "What seems like minutes on the surface can be years or decades below. Your grandfather spent months down there, though only hours passed in the world above." When Henry finally emerged from the mine, he was no longer the young man who had entered. His hair had gone completely white, his face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his eyes held a knowledge that no human mind was meant to contain. He looked at the four women with an expression of infinite sadness and understanding. "I see why you stay," he said in a voice that sounded decades older than his years. "I see what you're guarding against. But I also see what it's cost you." Jake watched as his grandfather looked at his own hands, seeing the way the skin had begun to take on a translucent quality that reminded him uncomfortably of old parchment. Whatever Henry had seen in the depths had changed him on a fundamental level, and that change was spreading through his body like a slow poison. "He made us a bargain," Eleanor's voice continued as Jake watched the conversation between his grandfather and the four women. "He would help us strengthen the seals on the mine, add his knowledge to our own, but in exchange we would keep his secret. The world could never know what lay beneath Silverton, and his family could never know what had really happened to him." "But what did happen to him?" Jake asked aloud, though he wasn't sure if the question was heard in the vision or only in his own mind. The answer came not in words but in images. Jake saw his grandfather working alongside the women to create new barriers over the mine entrance. Barriers that incorporated symbols and materials that definitely hadn't existed in 1962. He saw Henry growing weaker and more translucent with each passing day, the strange energy he had absorbed in the depths slowly consuming him from within. And finally, Jake saw his grandfather make the ultimate sacrifice. In a ritual that took place at midnight on the summer solstice, Henry Morrison gave up the last of his humanity to become something else entirely, a guardian spirit bound to Silverton for all eternity. His physical body dissolved into motes of light that merged with the barriers over the mine, but his consciousness remained, standing eternal watch over the horrors that lay beneath. The vision ended abruptly, and Jake found himself back in the present, standing in the dusty street with the four women watching him with expressions of infinite patience. But now he understood what he was looking at. These weren't ordinary women who had somehow survived for over 60 years in an abandoned town. They were like his grandfather, transformed by their contact with whatever lay beneath Silverton, bound to this place by forces that existed far beyond human comprehension. "Now you know," Margaret said simply, her formal manner making perfect sense now that Jake understood she was speaking across decades of isolation and responsibility. "Your grandfather didn't abandon your family, Mr. Morrison. He made a choice to protect not just them, but the entire world from something that should never be allowed to escape." Jake felt tears on his cheeks that he didn't remember shedding, a mixture of grief for the grandfather he had never known and pride for the sacrifice Henry had made. But beneath those emotions, he sensed something else stirring, the same compulsion that had driven him to search for Silverton in the first place. "The mine is still sealed," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Beatrice replied, but her voice carried a note of concern that made Jake's blood run cold. "But the seals weaken over time, Mr. Morrison, and your grandfather's essence, spread as thin as it is across the barriers, grows less effective with each passing year." "That's why you were expecting me," Jake realized with growing horror. "You need another Morrison to help maintain the seals." The four women said nothing, but their silence was answer enough. Jake looked around at the abandoned town, at the carefully maintained isolation that had kept the secret of Silverton hidden for over 6 decades. He thought about his life back in the world, his job as a motorcycle mechanic, his small apartment, his few friends who wouldn't even notice if he disappeared for weeks at a time. "What happens if I say no?" he asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. "You won't," Virginia replied with absolute certainty. "The Morrison blood calls to what lies beneath, just as what lies beneath calls to the Morrison blood. You've felt it since the moment you arrived here, haven't you? The sense that you belong, that this is where you were always meant to end up." Jake wanted to deny it, but he couldn't lie to himself. From the moment he had seen the smoke rising from the chimneys of the supposedly abandoned town, he had felt something stirring in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. This place was part of him in a way that defied explanation, and he was part of it. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked, though he already knew that the decision had been made the moment he had chosen to follow his grandfather's map. "The summer solstice is in 3 days," Eleanor said gently. "If you choose to take your grandfather's place, the ritual must be performed then. The barriers between worlds are thinnest at that time, making it possible to bind your essence to the seals without losing yourself entirely." "And if I don't?" Margaret's expression grew grave. "Then the seals will continue to weaken, and eventually they will fail entirely. What lies beneath Silverton will be free to spread across the world, and humanity will face horrors that it has no framework for understanding or combating." Jake closed his eyes and tried to imagine walking away, climbing back on his motorcycle and riding out of Silverton as if none of this had ever happened. But even the thought of it filled him with a revulsion so profound that it made him physically nauseous. This was his destiny, had always been his destiny, and fighting it would be like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. "Will I still be me?" he asked, opening his eyes to look at the 4 women who would become his companions for whatever remained of his existence. "In all the ways that matter," Beatrice assured him, though Jake noticed she didn't meet his eyes when she said it. "Your consciousness will remain intact, your memories preserved, but you will be changed, Mr. Morrison. Changed in ways that will make your old life seem like a half-remembered dream." Jake nodded slowly, feeling the weight of 61 years of mystery finally lifting from his shoulders. His grandfather hadn't been a selfish wanderer who had abandoned his family. He had been a hero who had made an impossible choice to protect the world from something it could never be allowed to face. "I'll need to call my work, let them know I won't be coming back," Jake said, and was surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "There's no cell service in Silverton," Eleanor said with what might have been sympathy. "There never has been. But don't worry about your old life, Mr. Morrison. When you don't return from your motorcycle trip, people will assume you met with an accident somewhere in the desert. There will be search parties for a while, but eventually they'll give up and move on. It's better that way." "Better for who?" Jake asked with a bitter laugh. "For everyone," Margaret replied firmly. "The world is not ready to know that places like Silverton exist, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps it never will be. Our job is to make sure it doesn't have to find out. Jake spent the next 3 days learning about his new responsibilities from the 4 women who would become his eternal companions. They showed him the symbols that had to be maintained, the rituals that had to be performed, the signs that indicated the seals were holding firm or beginning to weaken. They taught him about the history of the mine, about the companies that had dug too deep in their greed for precious metals and had instead found something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. Knowledge, Virginia explained as she showed Jake books filled with symbols that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. That's what lies beneath Silverton. Pure knowledge, distilled from sources that exist outside our understanding of reality. Some of the miners who survived their encounters with it gained insights into mathematics and physics that wouldn't be officially discovered for decades. Others learned to see through time itself, watching past and future play out like scenes in a movie. But knowledge like that comes with a price, Beatrice added, her voice carrying the weight of hard experience. The human mind wasn't designed to contain truths about the fundamental nature of reality. It's like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. Eventually, the container breaks. Jake learned that the 4 women had each paid a different price for their extended guardianship of Silverton. Margaret had gained the ability to see the true nature of anyone who entered the town, but she had lost the capacity to be surprised or delighted by anything. Eleanor could hear the thoughts of the entity that lay beneath the mine, allowing her to monitor its activities, but the constant alien whispers had cost her the ability to dream. Beatrice had developed an intuitive understanding of the symbols that held the seals in place, but her enhanced perception made it impossible for her to look at anything without seeing the decay and entropy that was slowly consuming it. And Virginia had become unstuck in time, able to perceive past and future simultaneously, but the constant flow of temporal information had left her unable to form new memories or maintain consistent relationships with linear time. Each guardian gives up something different, Margaret explained as Jake studied the ritual texts that would bind him to Silverton. The mind takes what it needs from each person to create the most effective possible guardian. We don't know what it will take from you, Mr. Morrison, but whatever it is, the loss will be balanced by a gain that will help you fulfill your duties. On the morning of the summer solstice, Jake woke before dawn and walked to the edge of town to watch the sun rise over the Nevada desert. He had spent the night dreaming of his old life, of the garage where he had worked for 5 years, of the friends who would wonder what had happened to him, of the family who would never know the truth about either him or his grandfather. But when the sun cleared the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake felt a peace settle over him that he had never experienced in his previous life. For the first time in his 24 years, he knew exactly where he belonged and exactly what he was supposed to be doing. The constant restlessness that had driven him from place to place, job to job, relationship to relationship, had finally found its resolution. "It's time," Eleanor said, appearing beside him with the silent grace that Jake had learned was characteristic of all 4 women. "Are you ready?" Jake took one last look at the world beyond Silverton, at the vast expanse of desert that stretched away toward a civilization that would never know what he had sacrificed to keep it safe. Then he nodded and followed Eleanor back into the town that would be his home for whatever remained of eternity. The ritual took place at the entrance to the mine, where Jake's grandfather's essence had been woven into barriers that pulsed with barely contained power. The 4 women formed a circle around Jake, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to resonate with frequencies far below and above human hearing. As they chanted, the symbols carved into the barriers began to glow more brightly, and Jake felt something stirring in the depths beneath his feet. The transformation began slowly, a tingling in his fingertips that gradually spread up his arms and through his torso. Jake felt his perception expanding, his consciousness opening to include sensory input that human beings were never meant to process. He could feel the weight of the earth above the mine, could sense the alien presence that waited in the darkness below, could perceive the delicate balance of forces that kept reality itself stable in this particular corner of the world. But as his awareness expanded, Jake realized that something was being taken away as well. The memories of his old life were fading, becoming distant and dreamlike, as if they had happened to someone else entirely. His emotional connections to the world beyond Silverton were dissolving, replaced by an overwhelming sense of duty and purpose that felt as natural as breathing. When the ritual was complete, Jake opened eyes that now held depths that hadn't been there before, and looked at his four companions with perfect understanding. He was no longer entirely human, no longer bound by the limitations that had defined his previous existence. He was something new, something that existed specifically to stand guard over secrets that could destroy the world if they were ever revealed. "Welcome to Silverton, Mr. Morrison," Margaret said with what might have been a smile. "Your watch begins now." Jake nodded and took his place among the guardians of Silverton, knowing that somewhere out there, another Morrison was growing up with the same restless energy that had driven him across the country. In 20 or 30 years, that person would find their way to this place, drawn by forces they couldn't understand or resist. And when they arrived, Jake would be waiting for them, ready to explain the choice they would have to make and the price they would have to pay. The cycle would continue, as it had continued for generations, as it would continue for generations yet to come. And in the depths beneath Silverton, ancient knowledge waited patiently for the day when humanity would be ready to face the truths it contained, or when the seals would finally fail and those truths would be forced upon a world that had forgotten how to believe in the impossible. Until that day came, Jake Morrison would stand watch alongside four mysterious women who had given up their humanity to protect a world that would never know their names or understand their sacrifice. It wasn't the life he had planned, but as he felt his grandfather's essence merge with his own, strengthening the barriers that held back the darkness, Jake realized it was exactly the life he had been born to live.